Welcome into one of the most disturbing forgotten chapters of American history. Tonight's story takes us back to Natchez, 1841, where fear crept silently through plantations and family homes, leaving behind shattered bloodlines and unanswered questions. Before we descend into this two-year nightmare, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, and if you value deeply researched, true historical horror that takes days of digging through real records. Make sure you subscribe, because stories like this don't tell themselves, they have to be uncovered. In 1841, Natchez stood as a symbol of Southern wealth and quiet cruelty, a river town glowing with prosperity on the surface while rot spread underneath. Grand homes overlooked the Mississippi, their white columns polished and proud. Yet behind those walls lived fear, secrecy, and unspoken violence. The town thrived on cotton and human bondage, and silence was the currency that kept everything running smoothly. People knew better than to ask questions, because questions had a way of disturbing the fragile order everyone depended on. The enslaved population in Natchez outnumbered the free in many areas, but their voices were deliberately buried. Whispers passed through slave quarters at night, stories carried in hushed tones, never spoken in daylight. Overseers enforced obedience through punishment, and any sign of unrest was crushed before it could grow. This constant pressure created a town that appeared calm, but was emotionally volatile, like a powder keg waiting for a spark. White families lived with an illusion of control, believing the system they built would protect them forever. Patrols moved through the streets after dark, and laws were written to keep enslaved people isolated and fearful. Yet beneath that control was anxiety, an unspoken dread that the violence used to maintain order might someday return in unexpected ways. Natchez pretended to sleep peacefully, but it never truly rested. Religion played a powerful role in shaping the town's identity, offering moral justification for brutality. Sermons preached obedience and divine order, while cruelty was framed as necessity rather than sin. Churches stood as places of worship by day and instruments of control by night, reinforcing the belief that suffering was part of a natural design. This warped morality allowed horrors to hide in plain sight. The Mississippi River was Natchez's lifeline, carrying wealth, travelers, and secrets alike. Boats arrived daily, bringing news from other states and carrying away the truth of what happened within the town's borders. Crimes could disappear as easily as bodies slipped into the dark water, leaving no trace behind. The river watched everything and told nothing. Within this environment, fear became normalized. Violence was so common that only the most extreme acts drew attention, while smaller cruelties blended into daily life. This numbness made Natchez dangerous, not because people were unaware of evil, but because they had learned to ignore it. When suffering becomes routine, warning signs stop looking like warnings. By the time the first family fell, Natchez was already prepared to look away. The town's culture of silence, control, and denial created the perfect conditions for a nightmare to grow unchecked. What happened next was not sudden or accidental. It was the inevitable result of a society that refused to listen, refused to question, and refused to see the darkness it had created. The three brothers were born into bondage, their lives predetermined before they ever took their first breaths. Records from the period rarely bothered to preserve their names, reducing them instead to property listed in ledgers and estate inventories. From childhood, they were separated from any sense of safety, learning early that survival depended on obedience, silence, and endurance. Family for them was not protected by law but threatened by it, always at risk of being torn apart without warning. They grew up on the same land, worked under the same overseers, and shared the same daily humiliations. The brothers learned to communicate without words, exchanging looks and gestures that carried meaning only they understood. In a world where speaking freely could lead to punishment or death, this silent bond became their strength. It also set them apart, making others uneasy without knowing why. Violence was woven into their upbringing. They watched whippings carried out as public warnings, saw bodies scarred and broken for minor disobedience, and learned that mercy was rare and unpredictable. Each punishment served as a lesson. Power belonged to those who inflicted pain, not those who suffered it. Over time, this lesson carved itself deeply into their understanding of the world. The brothers were known among the enslaved community as quiet and observant, rarely drawing attention to themselves. They listened more than they spoke, absorbing the rhythms of plantation life, the movements of overseers, and the routines of the families who owned them. This awareness, born from necessity, later became dangerous knowledge. Every habit, every weakness was carefully noted. As they reached adulthood, their paths began to harden. Opportunities for escape were non-existent, and hope faded into something darker. The anger they carried was not explosive, but controlled, shaped by years of restraint. It was the kind of anger that waits patiently, growing sharper with time, instead of burning out. Their bond as brothers deepened in ways few could understand. They were not just family, they were witnesses to one another's suffering. Each scar, each loss, was shared, discussed in whispers under cover of night. This shared trauma forged a unity that replaced fear with resolve, creating something far more dangerous than desperation. By the time their story began to surface in the shadows of Natchez, the brothers were no longer just victims of a brutal system. They were products of it, shaped and hardened by everything they had endured. The origins of the three brothers were steeped in silence, suffering, and survival, and from those origins, a nightmare quietly took form. Life under bondage stripped the brothers of any illusion of control over their own futures. Every sunrise brought the same uncertainty: who would be punished, who would be sold, who would disappear by nightfall. Their labor was endless, their exhaustion ignored, and their humanity denied at every turn. They learned quickly that emotions were liabilities, because grief and anger were dangerous when displayed openly. Resentment did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated slowly, like layers of dust no one bothered to clean. Each injustice added weight: the stolen childhoods, the broken families, the constant surveillance. The brothers watched mothers beg for their children, men dragged away in chains, and promises made by masters that were never kept. These moments carved resentment deeper than any physical wound. The rules governing their lives were deliberately inconsistent, designed to keep them off balance. One day obedience earned a nod of approval, the next, the same behavior was met with punishment. This unpredictability taught them that fairness did not exist in their world. Trust eroded, replaced by a quiet certainty that survival required self-reliance and secrecy. They were denied education, yet they learned through observation. They studied how authority functioned, how fear was used as a tool, and how violence enforced obedience. Over time, they began to understand that power was not just held, it was taken. This realization did not free them, but it reshaped how they saw the world around them. Resentment also grew from witnessing the hypocrisy of those who claimed moral superiority. Masters prayed loudly while ordering whippings, preached discipline while indulging cruelty, and spoke of civilization while living off suffering. These contradictions were impossible to ignore. For the brothers, the moral structure of Natchez collapsed under its own lies. The pressure of constant submission began to twist into something darker. Hope, once fragile, faded entirely, leaving behind a cold determination. They stopped imagining better futures and focused instead on enduring the present. In this mental shift, resentment transformed from pain into purpose, something they carried with deliberate care. By the time resentment fully took hold, it was no longer loud or chaotic. It was controlled, calculated, and deeply rooted. Life under bondage had not broken the brothers, it had reshaped them. What grew inside them was not just anger at their condition, but a hardened resolve born from years of silent suffering, waiting for a moment when endurance would no longer be enough. The first signs were so subtle that most people dismissed them as coincidence. Small disturbances on plantations were explained away as accidents, misunderstandings, or the natural disorder of managing enslaved labor. A tool went missing, a barn door was left open, livestock wandered off without explanation. These incidents caused irritation but not alarm, blending easily into the daily chaos of plantation life. Among the enslaved community, however, quiet unease began to spread. There were whispers of late-night movements, of figures seen where no one should have been. Some spoke of overheard conversations abruptly cut short, of brothers who seemed to know things before they happened. These murmurs stayed low, carried only between trusted ears, because speaking too openly could bring punishment down on everyone. Overseers noticed changes too, though they rarely admitted it aloud. Certain routines no longer felt predictable. Dogs barked at empty fields, patrols reported shadows without explanation, and paths once considered safe felt suddenly exposed. Yet pride prevented deeper investigation. To acknowledge fear would have meant admitting loss of control, something Natchez refused to do. The brothers themselves remained outwardly unchanged. They worked, followed orders, and avoided drawing attention. This normalcy made them invisible, and invisibility was their greatest shield. While others reacted emotionally to brutality, they appeared distant, almost numb, which allowed them to pass beneath suspicion without effort. Rumors of violence beyond Natchez reached the town through the Mississippi River. Tales of uprisings and revenge whispered from dock to dock. Instead of prompting caution, these stories hardened attitudes. Patrols increased, punishments became harsher, and fear was met with force rather than reflection. This escalation only deepened the tension already simmering beneath the surface. Those closest to the situation sensed that something was wrong, but lacked the language to describe it. Fear without a clear source is easy to ignore, People convinced themselves that what they felt was imagination, exhaustion, or superstition. In a town built on denial, uncertainty was easier to bury than confront. By the time the early whispers took shape, the warning signs had already been missed. What seemed like scattered disturbances were, in truth, the beginning of a pattern. Natchez stood at the edge of a growing darkness, but its people had been trained too well to look away, and in that silence, the nightmare found room to grow. The moment the first family fell, it did not arrive with screams or public spectacle. It came quietly, wrapped in confusion and disbelief. What was discovered felt impossible, as if reality itself had fractured. In a town accustomed to cruelty, this incident still stood apart, unsettling those who encountered it and leaving officials struggling to make sense of what they saw. At first, explanations were simple and convenient. Some suggested an internal dispute, others blamed outsiders passing through on the river. Natchez preferred answers that did not require deep examination, answers that allowed life to continue uninterrupted. The idea that something more deliberate was unfolding was quickly pushed aside, replaced by denial disguised as logic. The family had been known, respected within their circle, and deeply rooted in the community. Their sudden absence created a vacuum that people filled with rumors rather than truth. Doors closed earlier at night. Conversations lowered in volume, and eyes lingered longer on unfamiliar faces. Fear entered quietly, but no one was willing to name it. Among the enslaved population, the reaction was different. The news traveled fast, passed in glances and broken sentences. There was no celebration, only tension. Some sensed that this was not an isolated act, but the beginning of something larger. Others worried about the retaliation that would surely follow, knowing punishment rarely waited for proof. Authorities responded with surface-level urgency. Patrols were briefly increased. Questions asked without real intent to listen, and conclusions drawn far too quickly. The goal was reassurance, not truth. Once the appearance of order was restored, attention drifted elsewhere, leaving the deeper mystery untouched. What made the first fall especially haunting was how quickly it faded from open discussion. Within weeks, it became an uncomfortable subject, one mentioned only in private, if at all. The town's instinct to forget kicked in, smoothing over the cracks with routine and ritual. Life resumed, but it did so unevenly, as if something vital had shifted. In hindsight, the first family's fall was not just a tragedy, it was a warning. It marked the moment when the nightmare crossed from possibility into reality. Natchez had its chance to stop what was coming, but by choosing silence over scrutiny, the town unknowingly opened the door to 2 years of destruction that would follow. As more incidents surfaced, subtle similarities began to emerge, though few were willing to connect them. The locations varied, the circumstances differed, yet something about each event felt familiar. Doors left unsecured, watchdogs inexplicably silent, routines disrupted at precise moments. Individually, these details meant little, but together they formed a shape that was hard to ignore. Those who paid close attention noticed timing was never random. Each act occurred when households were most vulnerable, during storms, busy harvest periods, or moments of reduced supervision. Whoever was responsible understood the rhythms of plantation life intimately. This knowledge suggested patience and planning, not impulse or chaos, but that conclusion was too unsettling for most to accept. Officials reviewed cases separately, never side by side. By isolating each event, they avoided confronting the possibility of a larger threat. Reports were filed, explanations offered, and files quietly closed. This compartmentalization wasn't accidental, it was a defense mechanism, a way to preserve the belief that control had not been lost. Among enslaved workers, patterns were clearer, though rarely spoken aloud. Certain routes were avoided after dark. Certain nights felt heavier than others. People sensed connections not because of evidence, but because of instinct sharpened by survival. Still, fear of punishment kept the observations buried. The brothers' behavior remained consistent, too consistent. They were present when expected, absent only when permitted, and never associated with disruption. This predictability made them blend seamlessly into the background. In a society obsessed with visible defiance, quiet conformity was rarely questioned. As tension grew, plantation owners responded by tightening restrictions rather than investigating causes. Curfews were enforced more harshly, discipline intensified, and suspicion spread indiscriminately. These reactions created more chaos, masking the very patterns that could have exposed the truth. The system attacked symptoms while ignoring origins. What no one wanted to admit was that the danger was not external or sudden, it was embedded. The pattern was there, repeating with chilling consistency, but it required humility to see it. Natchez lacked that humility, and in its place stood denial, allowing the nightmare to continue. Unchallenged and evolving with each passing incident, fear did not arrive all at once, it seeped in slowly, settling into daily life until it felt permanent. Families who once moved freely now planned every step, watching the sun more closely and listening for unfamiliar sounds after dark. Nightfall, once routine, became something to endure. Lamps stayed lit longer, doors were checked twice, and sleep came only in fragments. Conversations changed across Natchez. Laughter softened, and silence filled spaces where confidence once lived. People spoke in half sentences, careful not to say too much or draw attention. Rumors traveled faster than facts, each retelling adding new shadows to the truth. The lack of clear answers made imagination more frightening than reality. Plantation owners attempted to project strength, but their behavior betrayed them. Guards were repositioned, patrols doubled, and weapons kept closer at hand. These measures were meant to reassure, yet they only confirmed that something was wrong. Fear is contagious, and once authority begins to display it, everyone feels exposed. Among the enslaved population, fear took on a different shape. It was quieter, heavier, and layered with the knowledge that any disruption would bring consequences. Nights became tense, with people listening not just for danger, but for signs of collective punishment. Survival depended on staying unnoticed, even as anxiety tightened its grip. Children sensed the change most clearly. They were warned to stay close, to speak less, to obey without question. Stories meant to frighten them into safety spread quickly, filling young minds with images they couldn't escape. Fear settled early, shaping memories before understanding could catch up. Churches filled more often, not with hope, but desperation. Prayers were offered for protection rather than forgiveness, for safety rather than salvation. Faith became a shield against uncertainty, though even belief felt fragile. When fear reaches into sacred spaces, it becomes something deeper than panic. It becomes doubt. By the time fear fully spread across plantations and households, it had become part of the landscape. People adjusted to it the way they adjusted to heat or hunger, accepting it as unavoidable. This normalization was the nightmare's greatest ally. When fear becomes ordinary, resistance fades, and Natchez, trembling in silence, unknowingly surrendered to it. By the time the seventh family was destroyed, denial was no longer possible, though many still tried. What had once been treated as isolated tragedy now felt like a curse moving methodically through Natchez. Each loss carried its own details, its own shock, but together they formed a chain too heavy to ignore. The number itself became frightening, not because people counted bodies, but because they counted households, legacies, names erased from the town's future. Each family represented more than a single incident. They were pillars of their communities, connected through business, marriage, and shared history. Their disappearances left gaps that could not be filled, properties abandoned or hastily sold, routines permanently broken. Neighbors avoided speaking their names aloud, as if doing so might invite the same fate. Memory itself became something dangerous. What made the pattern especially terrifying was its reach. These families were not clustered in one place or bound by one mistake. Distance offered no protection, status no shield. The realization spread that safety was an illusion, and that whatever force was at work moved freely, unrestrained by boundaries people once trusted. Officials struggled to maintain authority as panic crept closer to the surface. Meetings were held behind closed doors, decisions made without transparency, and reassurances issued that convinced no one. The truth that they did not understand what was happening hung heavily in the air. Leadership weakened when answers failed to appear. Within the enslaved community, the weight of 7 families carried a different meaning. There was dread, but also awareness that the response would not be measured. History had taught them that fear among the powerful often turned into violence against the powerless. Every new loss tightened the risk of mass punishment. Social life collapsed under the pressure. Gatherings were cancelled, travel reduced, and hospitality replaced by suspicion. Friends began to look like potential threats, and strangers were no longer welcomed. Natchez, once defined by connection and trade, shrank inward, each household becoming an island of anxiety. 7 families marked the point of no return. The nightmare was no longer hidden or theoretical. It was proven, repeated, and devastatingly real. Whatever force had been unleashed now had a record written in lives and silence, and Natchez stood trapped within it, knowing the worst truth of all. It still wasn't over. 2 years is a long time for fear to survive, and in Natchez it did more than survive, it evolved. What began as shock hardened into routine, a grim cycle that repeated itself with disturbing consistency. Seasons changed, cotton was planted and harvested, children grew older, yet the threat never left. The nightmare did not burn quickly and disappear. It lingered, patient and relentless, stretching itself across time. As months passed, people adjusted their lives around the danger rather than confronting it. Precautions became habits, and habits became rules. Certain roads were no longer used after dusk, certain workers were reassigned, certain nights were spent awake by design. This constant state of alert drained the town, replacing urgency with exhaustion. The length of the terror eroded trust in authority. Each promise that the danger was contained proved false, and each failure weakened confidence further. Lawmen were present but ineffective, visible yet powerless. Over time, their presence felt symbolic rather than protective, a reminder that the system designed to enforce order had limits it could not admit. For the enslaved population, the 2 years felt even longer. Time already moved slowly under bondage, and fear stretched it further. Every new incident risked collective punishment. Every rumor threatened retaliation. Survival meant navigating not just danger, but the reactions of those who controlled their lives. The nightmare layered fear upon fear. Psychological damage spread quietly. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, and constant anxiety became common, though no one spoke of them openly. Children grew up believing danger was permanent. Adults learned to live without peace. Even moments of calm felt suspicious, as if safety itself could not be trusted. The endurance of the nightmare changed how people remembered the past. Life before the violence began to feel distant and unreal, like a story told by someone else. Natchez redefined itself around loss and caution, its identity reshaped by 2 years of unanswered questions and unresolved terror. By the end of those 2 years, the damage extended far beyond the families directly affected. The town itself was altered, its spirit worn thin by prolonged fear. A nightmare that lasts a night leaves scars. One that lasts 2 years reshapes everything it touches. Natchez would never fully return to what it had been before the darkness settled in and refused to leave. What unsettled investigators most was not just what happened, but how it was done. There was no chaos, no obvious struggle left behind, no signs of reckless behavior. Each incident suggested planning and restraint, as if the perpetrators understood exactly how much force to use and when to disappear. The absence of noise and witnesses pointed to patience rather than impulse. The methods relied heavily on familiarity. Whoever was responsible knew household routines, shift changes, and moments of vulnerability. Doors were approached at the right hour, paths taken that avoided detection, and timing chosen to reduce resistance. This level of precision could only come from long observation, from living within the system rather than outside it. Equally disturbing was what was left untouched. Valuables were often ignored, and there was little indication of theft as a primary motive. This wasn't driven by profit or desperation. The focus appeared deliberate, directed, and personal in ways that confused authorities accustomed to simple explanations like robbery or revenge. Motives were harder to define, and that uncertainty fed fear. Some believed it was revenge rooted in past cruelty, others suspected a desire to instill terror rather than achieve a specific gain. The truth likely sat in a darker space, shaped by years of oppression, humiliation, and unresolved rage. Motive, in this case, was not a single reason, but a convergence of many wounds. What made the methods especially effective was their predictability to the perpetrators and unpredictability to everyone else. They struck when least expected, then vanished completely. Each success reinforced confidence, allowing the pattern to continue without interference. The system's blind spots became tools rather than obstacles. Psychologically, the acts served a purpose beyond their immediate impact. They shattered the illusion of absolute control that defined Natchez's power structure. Fear shifted direction, flowing upward instead of down. This reversal, even if temporary, disrupted the social order in ways that frightened those who depended on it. In the end, the methods and motives revealed something deeply unsettling. This was not madness, nor random brutality. It was calculated, shaped by environment and experience. Whatever line had been crossed, it was crossed with intention. And once crossed, it could not easily be uncrossed. The nightmare was not only about what was done, but about what had been learned along the way. The end did not come with triumph or relief, but with exhaustion and confusion. After 2 years of unanswered terror, the pressure to stop the nightmare finally outweighed the desire to deny it. What changed was not sudden bravery, but accumulation. Too many losses, too many patterns ignored, too many nights spent waiting for the next disaster. The town could no longer pretend control had never slipped. Attention turned inward, and scrutiny sharpened in places long overlooked. Movements were watched more closely, routines questioned, absences noted. The very familiarity that had once provided cover now became a liability. Small inconsistencies, once dismissed, began to stand out against the backdrop of repeated violence. The brothers were not exposed through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet unraveling, a missed detail, a contradiction, a moment when timing failed to align. It was the kind of mistake inevitable after prolonged secrecy. Once suspicion took hold, it spread quickly, fed by fear and the desperate need for an ending. When the truth surfaced, it shocked even those who believed they had seen everything. The realization that the threat had lived within the system, hidden in plain sight, was deeply unsettling. It forced Natchez to confront not just the crimes themselves, but the blindness that allowed them to continue for so long. There was no clean resolution. Justice, as defined by the time, was swift and severe, focused more on restoring order than understanding causes. Questions about motive, responsibility, and systemic failure were pushed aside in favor of closure. The goal was to end the fear, not to examine its roots. For the enslaved community, the ending brought little comfort. Retaliation, suspicion, and tighter control followed, as authorities sought reassurance through dominance. The conclusion of the nightmare did not mean safety. It meant another shift in pressure, another reminder of vulnerability. The rain ended, but its shadow remained. Natchez had stopped the immediate threat, yet it could not undo the damage or reclaim what was lost. The silence returned, heavier than before, carrying the knowledge that the nightmare had not come from nowhere, and that its end had cost far more than anyone was willing to admit. History has a way of choosing what it remembers and what it quietly buries. In the case of Natchez, this story was never meant to survive intact. Records were incomplete, names faded from documents, and uncomfortable details were omitted altogether. What remained was a simplified version of events that avoided deeper examination, allowing the town to move forward without confronting its own reflection. For those in power, forgetting was a form of protection. Acknowledging how the nightmare unfolded would have meant admitting failure of authority, of control, of moral certainty. It was easier to label the events as an anomaly and seal them away than to question the system that allowed them to happen. Silence became an act of preservation. The enslaved voices who understood the truth most clearly were never asked to speak, and even if they were, few would have listened. Their memories lived on only in fragments, passed quietly through generations, distorted by fear and survival. Oral history carried what written history refused to hold, though even those stories weakened over time. As decades passed, Natchez reshaped its identity. Grand homes were celebrated, river commerce remembered, and elegance romanticized. The nightmare did not fit the image the town wanted to present. Darkness was edited out of the narrative, replaced with nostalgia that ignored the cost at which that past was built. For historians, the lack of clear documentation created doubt. Without complete records, stories like this were dismissed as exaggerated or unreliable. Yet absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, it was evidence of deliberate erasure. What was lost on paper still left scars in memory and consequence. Forgetting also served as a warning disguised as comfort. By erasing the past, future generations were denied the chance to learn from it. The conditions that allowed the nightmare to grow were never fully examined, leaving room for repetition in new forms, under new names, in new places. This is why the story matters now. Remembering what history tried to forget is not about blame alone, it is about understanding. Natchez's nightmare was not an isolated horror, but a mirror held up to a system built on silence and suffering. When stories like this are ignored, the darkness doesn't disappear. It simply waits to be rediscovered.